Good morning, everybody. Good morning. My name is David Stewart. I'm the Director of Libraries here at Bethel University. And it is a great privilege to welcome you here today. And we're especially happy to see so many guests, people that we don't usually see here in the library. We have a rather eventful program this morning, and we're glad that you can be here for it. I'm going to ask one of my colleagues, Arlene, to step up here, and she will be taking it for the first part. Go right ahead.
In 2009, the Friends of the Bethel University Library Organization established an annual $300 scholarship in memory of Connie J. Larson, one of our former reference librarians, in commemoration of her service to the Bethel University Library and in celebration of her dedication to the training, supervision, and development of student library assistants. And this scholarship now is awarded each year to a student who works in the Bethel University Library. The 2011 and 2012 recipient of the Connie J. Larson Memorial Scholarship Award is Katie Creelman. And I'd like to just share a few comments that her supervisor made about Katie in her recommendation. Katie is an exceptional student worker. She has a positive attitude with even the most mundane tasks. I appreciate Katie's efficiency and competence as she prepares new materials for use to the Bethel community. I am grateful that Katie is receiving this public acknowledgement for her work behind the scenes. So congratulations, Katie, and thank you so much for your service to our library. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Arlene, and congratulations to Katie for her fine work. The second special event this morning involves the research prize, and we're very grateful for the help of the Friends of the Library group in funding this. And we're also very honored to have had so many fine competitors for this award. I have in my office over there, if you look, you can see on top of the cabinet a picture of Samuel Johnson, whose 300th anniversary was celebrated last year. One of the things about being smart and legendary is that if you say a few smart and memorable things, you get credit for saying lots of other things. Abraham Lincoln, Mark Twain, people like that. A quote that's attributed to Dr. Johnson runs as follows. A young scholar came to him with a manuscript and asked him to review it. And according to legend, Dr. Johnson said, after reading it, "Your manuscript is both good and original. The trouble is that the good parts are not original, and the original parts are not good." And it's a wonderful quote, which I've got good use out of, but we don't know who said it. He gets credit for having said that. And there's a scholar at Rutgers who has apparently everything Johnson ever actually said on a database, and there's no record that he actually said it. But we're very grateful to encourage actual and authentic scholarship at a very high level, and to be able to encourage that with the research prize. The prize has been offered now for how many years? 2, okay? It was ongoing before I came here. Awarded annually to encourage excellence in student research that makes substantial use of library resources and services, and demonstrates understanding of information literacy, competencies, and to promote undergraduate research. Students who may be present today are welcome to think now about submitting for the 2012 award. The deadline for that will be February 15th next year. I'd like to award, first of all, our honorable mention to Eric Magnuson for his research, and here's the focus of his research: The Convictions of Pope John Paul II, an exploration of liberation theology in Latin America. Congratulations, Eric. Eric, congratulations. Thank you for your fine work. Thank you very much. Our first prize winner this year is Nathan Cornelius. It's been a pleasure to have Eric, Nathan working here in the library since I came. And he will be giving a presentation today, his art research, innovation, and harmonization in Raphael, Stanza della Segnatura. Nathan, could you come up and receive our prize? Thank you so much for your time.
Well, my name is Nathan. I am a junior music performance major here at Bethel. And my research project was for Renaissance Rococo art history, which I took last spring with Dr. Rosa. And it was a really great class. I highly recommend any of Wayne's classes to you if you're interested in this kind of thing. I learned a lot from it. And today I'm going to talk about some of the research I did on the Stanza della Segnatura, which is a room that contains a series of paintings by the artist Raphael. And the title of my paper was Innovation and Harmonization in Raphael's Stanza della Segnatura. And innovation and harmonization kind of describe the two main aspects of what I discovered about the meaning of these images. But first, I'd just like to give you a little background about the stanza. Raphael was born in 1480, and he was one of the leading artists of the Italian Renaissance, right up there with Da Vinci and with Michelangelo. He moved to Rome in 1507. Before that, his career had been mostly in Florence. And he moved to Rome because Pope Julius II had hired him for various projects, one of which was to paint the stanza. Pope Julius was a great patron of the arts, and he did all sorts of projects, one of which was tearing down the old St. Peter's Cathedral and building a new one. He built the Sistine Chapel and lots of other stuff. But the situation was that the papacy was kind of caught in this power struggle between various Italian families who would each try to get one of their members elected pope so that they could have the political power that went along with that. And so the previous pope, before Julius, had been a pretty strong enemy of his family, and they were kind of rivals in the papal elections. And so after he finally did become pope, he decided that he couldn't really even stand to live in the same apartments that his predecessor had occupied. And so he decided to move upstairs and remodel the Vatican Palace. And so as part of that project, he hired Raphael to paint the walls. The stanza by the way, is the Italian word for room. And so it's a series of rooms today. You can visit them. They're in the Vatican museums, and they're just called the Raphael rooms. But the Stanza della Segnatura is one of 4 of these rooms, and they're on the 3rd floor, right by the arrow in this view of the Vatican. You can see the new St. Peter's Cathedral, which was under construction at this time, just right by there. And incidentally, in this gabled building, right here, that's where the Sistine Chapel is. And Michelangelo was actually painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel right at the same time that Raphael was painting the stanza. And so I thought it was kind of amazing that these two masterpieces of Renaissance art were created literally down the hall from each other and right at the exact same time. Here's a floor plan of the stanza. The Stanza della Segnatura, which is the room that I did my research on, that's room B. It's not a very large room. It's only about 27 feet by 21 feet. And this is what it would look like as you were coming in. It's called the Stanza della Segnatura because later popes used it as a place where they would put their signature on papal decrees and stuff. But originally, Pope Julius was intending to use it as his personal library. And so Raphael's instructions were to paint murals on each of the walls depicting 4 main branches of knowledge, or you can even say call numbers, represented in the Pope's library. And those were theology, philosophy, law, and poetry. And we don't know exactly how detailed Raphael's instructions were, but that was basically his assignment. So this is the first wall. This is what you would see straight ahead of you as you walked into the room. It's called the Disputa, which is short for the Disputation over the Holy Sacrament, and it represents theology. And it's an imaginary scene of a theological discussion about the nature of the Eucharist. And there's various figures from church history and from the Bible kind of all discussing this. And then up above, there's kind of this scene of heaven opening, and there's clouds and gold halos. And there's a manifestation of the Trinity. There's God the Father and Christ and the dove of the Holy Spirit appearing in the sky. The wall to your left as you would come in is jurisprudence or law. It contains 3 scenes. Raphael had split them up because there's this huge window in the middle of this wall. So on the left is the Emperor Justinian receiving his law code, which was important because it was the foundation for many of the law codes that were used in Europe throughout the Middle Ages and even past the time of Raphael. On the right is Pope Gregory IX receiving the canon law, which was the law by which the Catholic Church government operated. And then up above are some allegorical figures, probably representing the cardinal virtues, prudence, temperance, and fortitude. And so they're there to show that both secular law and the church law are both under these universal principles of justice, which are embodied in these allegorical figures. The third wall, the one to your right, is titled Parnassus. It's about poetry. Parnassus in Greek mythology was the home of Apollo, the god of poetry. And so metaphorically, it was the site of poetic, literary, or musical inspiration. So at the center is Apollo playing his lyre. And then on either side of him are some of the muses. And then there's a gathering of famous poets. There's some ancient Greek and Roman poets like Homer and Virgil and Pindar. And there's also some more recent poets, at least close to Raphael's time, like Dante and Petrarch. And then the fourth wall, which is probably the best known of the four, is the School of Athens, representing philosophy. And this depicts Athens in the 4th century BC, when there was a lot of philosophers developing their new ideas, which became very influential for Greek and Roman and all of Western civilization. And foremost among them were Plato and Aristotle, and they're the two people that you can see kind of walking towards you at the center of this scene. And then there's other philosophers around them discussing all their many theories. Raphael also painted the ceiling. There's the 4 round panels on the ceiling contain more allegorical female figures who are personifications of the 4 branches of learning, justice, philosophy, poetry, and law, and theology. Then in between them, there's these 4 square scenes which have biblical or historical or mythological incidents that relate to these themes. For example, between theology and justice, down in this corner, is the fall of Adam and Eve, because that's a demonstration of God's justice in punishing sin, and it's also an important theological concept, so it kind of links those 2 areas. And then in the center of the ceiling, there's this octagonal panel which has some symbols of the Pope and of Pope Julius's family in it, so it's clear that he owned the room. On the floor, there's an intricate pattern of mosaic tiles and stuff, and then there would have been bookcases around the edges. And then when later popes quit using the room for a library, the bookcases were removed and they were replaced by some more decorative paintings. So those are the images that Raphael created within the stanza. And the first part of my paper I refer to as innovation, because it talks about how Raphael took this tradition, the traditions and genres of art that existed in his time, and kind of reinvented them and developed them, made them much more sophisticated in the way that he used the concept of the room and his composition of the pictures to create a unified and compelling whole in the room. So one tradition was known as uomini famosi, which means famous men, and it refers to the practice of depicting historical or allegorical figures on the walls of a library. And this was actually a fairly common thing in Renaissance Italy. The idea being that you would see pictures of the authors or the characters in the books you would read on the walls of the library as you went there. Raphael's teacher, the painter Perugino, did a painting like this. This one's called Fortitude, Temperance, and 6 Ancient Heroes. And so you can see these 2 allegorical figures, Fortitude and Temperance, floating up in the clouds. And then down below them are various characters from Greek and Roman history. In another part of the same library, he painted some prophets and sibyls. So there's some Old Testament figures. And you can see they're all very clearly labeled. It says Isaiah, Moses, Daniel, David, and so on. And they're all standing in a neat row. And then they're holding some sort of identifying attribute, so you can kind of tell who they are. Raphael's father was also an artist, and he worked on artworks like this as well. So Raphael would likely have been very familiar with this, this type of painting, and the Pope was probably expecting to get something like this when he hired Raphael to paint his library. So if that was what he's expecting to see, this is what he actually got. You'll notice there's no labels telling you who's who. They're not all standing in one straight line. But instead, Raphael has a much more complicated and dramatic composition. And I think the figures really do interact with each other like characters in a drama. And there is this idea in the Renaissance that you can depict what a person was like on the inside, what their mind was like, what their soul was like, by like their pose or their facial expression or their physical features as you portrayed them in an artwork. And I think that's what Raphael definitely does in the pictures in the stanza, that he achieves a lot of psychological depth through the way he chooses to depict each individual figure and the way they interact with each other. So he's really reinventing his genre on a much more sophisticated level. He also did this with Madonna and Child paintings. You can see the one on the left from before Raphael's time. It just seems a little flat and static, whereas Raphael's version is much more complex. There's much more psychological interest to it. It seems more natural. So this was something that he did just in general, is he took the existing genres and just made them even more powerful. Another tradition in Renaissance painting was called the Sacra Conversazione, which means the sacred conversation. And in this type of painting, the artist would mix figures from various historical periods in one scene to show that they really belong together in spirit. For example, Piero della Francesca painted an altarpiece. If you want to know more about this painting, you should just take Wayne's class, because I don't have time to talk about it now. But the point is that he's mixed, for example, the Virgin Mary and Jesus with medieval characters like St. Francis, who's wearing the gray robe, and with contemporary figures, the man in the suit of armor, who's actually the guy who commissioned the painting. And so they're all there because they can all speak to each other because they share the same spiritual heritage and the same ideas. And so the idea for Raphael is that when you visit a library and you read a book by some author, you are entering into a conversation with them, even though you live many hundreds of years apart, because you share the same ideas. Another aspect of Raphael's innovation is how he made all the images fit together, and that they're really intended to be interpreted and experienced as a whole. I found an interesting quote during my research that described the stanza as a Renaissance installation. You know, in contemporary art, you have installations where instead of just going and looking at pictures on a wall, you're kind of surrounded by the artwork. And there's maybe objects coming out into the room, or there's videos playing, or there's sound playing. And so you're really surrounded by it, and it's a kind of a total environment. And so when we look at the pictures of the stanza today, unless we have the ability to actually go there and visit them physically, we just have to see them one at a time, and we're like looking at them as slides. But for the original viewers, it was something where you would go and you would kind of experience them as this environment that surrounded you. And you would kind of take part in the conversation, and you would read the different paintings side by side and use one to interpret the other. And so it's pretty clear from the way that Raphael set up some of the pictures that he intended them to all form a whole. For example, in the School of Athens, you'll notice there's these statues in the background of the architectural space. The statue on the left is Apollo, who's the god of poetry, and that side of the wall is the one that's next to the painting about poetry. The statue on the right is Minerva, the goddess of justice, and that's the wall that's next to the painting about justice. On that wall, you again have these two figures, Emperor Justinian on the left and Pope Gregory on the right. Emperor Justinian, representing the secular law, is on the side next to philosophy, because that's the secular way of reasoning about the nature of the universe. And Pope Gregory is on the side next to theology, which is the specifically Christian way of reasoning about the nature of things. The ceiling paintings even play a part in this. For example, in the fall of Adam and Eve, down here, Adam is kind of gesturing like this, and if you follow the direction he's pointing, you come to the figure of theology, and theology is pointing downward towards the figure of Christ in the Disputa. And so the idea is that you look to theology to show you an answer for the sin and fallenness in the world, and theology shows you that the answer to that is found in Christ, and that's the function of theology for you. And then Raphael also did a great job of using perspective and geometric shapes to kind of reinforce what is the central point of each of his images. For example, in the Disputa, there's a very clear one-point perspective. You can see all the lines of the floor tiles all converge towards one point, and that point is actually right behind the host, which is the Eucharist bread, the body of Christ on the altar. And that's very appropriate because that's literally what's at the center of the discussion, and visually it's also at the center of the perspective. And then in addition to perspective, he uses these repeated kind of circular shapes. For example, the crowd of figures down here kind of forms an arch. Then these clouds up here and these figures, they form another arch. And then there's this round halo around the Holy Spirit. There's another round golden halo around Christ. And then there's an even larger one with the angels around God the Father. And then the actual boundary of the wall forms another even larger semicircle. So he takes this shape of kind of a circle or half circle and reuses it throughout the composition to unify it. And this was a favorite technique of Raphael, of using this kind of shape over and over within one image. In Parnassus, he uses triangles. You can see if you take Apollo and the two figures right next to him, that's one triangle. And then if you extend it down to these figures who come out into the foreground, that makes a larger triangle, which is the same shape. In the School of Athens, there's these repeated, again, semicircles above Plato and Aristotle, which really kind of focus your attention down onto those two figures. A parallel to this in Renaissance art is Da Vinci's Last Supper, because the vanishing point of the perspective is right behind Jesus. And then he further highlights the figure of Jesus by placing this window behind him. So he's using perspective and composition and architecture to really make it very clear what is the central point of the image. One last thing is the way he composed the figures, which had to have been a very difficult task because there's often 30 or 40 individual figures in each image. But he arranged them and set up their poses and gestures to carefully lead your eye through the image. For example, in the Disputa, your eye may be drawn to this figure in the foreground who's wearing the yellow and blue robe, and he's pointing towards the altar. And he's kind of pointing it out to this guy who's leaning over the railing here. So your eye will notice that figure, you'll follow his gesture and move across the painting to the other side, where there's this figure who's also wearing yellow and blue, and he's also pointing to the altar, to this other figure who's leaning over a railing. So there's these two sets of figures that are framing the picture, and they both keep your eye within the picture because once it gets to the edge, you see it and then you turn back. And then the gesture of this figure directs your eye up to this other tier of figures in heaven. And so that's kind of how he leads your eye through the image. The same thing in the Parnassus. You may notice this figure or this one who are both kind of coming out at you into the foreground. And then you can just kind of follow the figures and it leads you all the way through the picture and brings you back out the other side. So those were some of my observations about how Raphael constructed and composed this series of images. And then the second part of my paper is I call harmonization, which is my way of summing up the message of these paintings. One of the first writers to try to identify and interpret the message of the stanza was Giorgio Vasari, an early Renaissance art historian writing about 30 years or so after Raphael had done these paintings. And he described the subject of the School of Athens as the theologians reconciling philosophy and astrology with theology, which is a little strange because the school of Athens is philosophy, but theology is on a different wall. And so I think one aspect of it is he's obviously interpreting all the paintings together. He doesn't think that they're separate, discrete artworks. But there's some other aspects of his interpretation that seem a little strange at first. For example, he identifies the figure with the beard who's writing in the book as St. Matthew, which is a little strange because he's in the school of Athens and he's supposed to be a Greek philosopher, not a biblical character. He goes on to say certain astrologers in the school of Athens have inscribed figures on small tablets, like this one. And they send them to the evangelists by means of several very lovely angels, and the evangelists expound them. And so it's almost like he's envisioning that the figures come off the wall and they travel around the room and they talk to each other and their ideas interact. But still, it's kind of strange that he's putting all these biblical figures and angels into the scene of secular philosophy. But I think the idea that he's getting at is that the point of the stanza as a whole is that Christian revelation and Christian truth can show you kind of how all the discoveries of secular learning fit together. And so these pagan thinkers can use their philosophy or even astrology to come up with certain discoveries, and then you take those to the area of Christian doctrine, and it kind of shows you what the ultimate meaning of it is. And I think that actually what he has written on his slate is a very apt metaphor for this process of harmonization. You probably don't recognize what this is a diagram of. I didn't either. But it helps if you know that this figure is now believed to be Pythagoras, who was a Greek philosopher who had this system of kind of believing that the universe consisted of these mathematical relationships between numbers and kind of like the music of the spheres. And he talked a lot about music theory as well, and how in music theory there's this concept of the overtone series, and how any pitch also contains a whole bunch of other pitches in the mathematical relation to it. Like there's one that's twice the frequency, 3 times the frequency, 4 times, and so on. And that the universe is basically reducible to this series of mathematical proportions and harmonies. And so he has this diagram of the overtone series on his slate. And so I think that's a great metaphor for what Raphael is doing in painting the stanza, because he's interested in depicting philosophical harmonies to convey the unity of the world of knowledge, encompassing the fields of law, poetry, philosophy, and theology. And he's arguing that the various intellectual disciplines, especially philosophy and theology, are complementary and not contradictory, and that they can be harmonized with each other through rational inquiry and discussion. This figure in the white robe is in the school of Athens. He's actually right behind Pythagoras, or Matthew, as Vasari had it. And he's one of the few figures in the picture who actually looks at the viewer. Most of the philosophers are all kind of in their little groups discussing ideas with other people from their school. But he's not part of any one group. Instead, he looks at you as if to suggest that maybe all these people, they really are all pointing to the same ultimate truth. And that he appears to be a portrait of the same person as is found over on this side, which is in the Disputa. And in the Disputa, he's the guy who's actually pointing to the altar, showing you Christ's sacrifice as the ultimate Christian truth. And so by putting the same figure in both pictures, Raphael is indicating that philosophical truth and spiritual truth are ultimately in agreement with each other. And in fact, some scholars believe that this figure is actually a portrait of a Renaissance humanist by the name of Pico della Mirandola, who believed that all philosophies were reflections of an ultimate truth which synthesized them all. Raphael's use of geometric shapes once again reinforces these ideas. In medieval and Renaissance thought, the square symbolized the physical world, and the circles symbolized the spiritual world. And then the octagon, which was kind of partly like a circle and partly like a square, was a combination of the two. And churches were sometimes built in an octagonal shape to symbolize that they had to do with both this world and the spiritual world. And the octagon also suggests the octave, which is the foundation for all these musical or philosophical harmonies that Raphael is so interested in. And once you know this, you can start seeing squares and circles and octagons all over. I mean, you can just find them all over in the ceiling, in the floor. There's these 4 circles forming a square. There's a circle inside that. There's a circle inside that, and on and on and on. Yeah. Plato and Aristotle were known, obviously, for having very different philosophical approaches. And there'd been a lot of debate in the Renaissance about who was right, who was more right, Plato or Aristotle. And Raphael is saying that maybe they're both right, and the two schools of thought kind of balance and complement each other. And so he portrays Plato and Aristotle as physically balancing each other, even as their ideas are equal in weight. And the overall layout of the painting reflects a balance between Plato and the people from his school of thought on this side, and Aristotle and his followers on that side. And Raphael even is suggesting that this process of harmonization could even apply to non-Western, non-European schools of thought. If you'll notice, the figure kind of leaning over the shoulder of Pythagoras / Matthew is wearing a Turkish turban. And it seems that he stands for Islamic philosophy, which had made some significant contributions in the Middle Ages. And so Raphael's suggesting that there's even truth in Islamic philosophy which can be harmonized with Plato and with Augustine and with Christian thinkers and with classical thought, and that it all kind of goes together. So when I discovered this, my next question was, is Raphael being merely pluralistic and saying that all religions and all philosophies are equally true? But that's not what he's doing. He does clearly maintain that Christianity is the ultimate reflection of truth. And that's very clear from a comparison of the School of Athens and the Disputa. Remember that these paintings face each other on opposite sides of the room. And in the School of Athens, Plato and Aristotle appear to be advancing towards you, and you have this feeling that the painting is kind of coming at you. Whereas in the Disputa, the flow of the figures is away from the viewer towards the altar. And so there's kind of this idea that in the grand scheme of things, history is advancing out of paganism towards Christianity. The architecture in the School of Athens looks a lot like a Renaissance church. You would have like the nave or the central aisle this way that Plato and Aristotle are coming from, and then the transepts here where the philosophers are. Some have suggested that this architecture was actually based on the new St. Peter's Cathedral, which was being built at this time. So if that's the back of the church, then the front of the church would be on this side in the Disputa, and sure enough, that's where the altar is. That's where God's presence is manifested. And so, as a visitor to the stanza, walking in, you would literally be in front of all these secular thinkers, and you'd be closer to God than them, because you can see the manifestation of Christ, which kind of makes everything fit together. Now, the philosophers pointed to that same truth which is found in Christ, but they couldn't see it. So Plato is actually pointing upward, and he's pointing into this kind of empty, arched area of ceiling. Then in the exact same spot in the Disputa, there's this exact same shape of the semicircle, but this time it's the halo of Christ. Similarly, in the School of Athens, there's these 3 barrel vaults, 1, 2, 3. And then in the middle one, there's these 3 windows. And then in the Disputa, taking up this exact same area of the image is the 3 persons of the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so it's suggesting that even this pagan philosophy, insofar as it points to truth, points to the same truth that's found in the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. Raphael also even uses the perspective to communicate this idea. The vanishing point of the perspective in the School of Athens is actually right behind Plato and Aristotle. But you can't quite see it. Their swirling robes kind of obscure the view. Whereas in the School of Athens, the vanishing point is at the host, and it's very clear, you can see it. So whereas secular philosophy points to truth, but you can't quite, it doesn't quite get there. Through Christian revelation, you can clearly see what is the ultimate meaning of the universe and of God's plan for it. So, just real quickly, some closing things that I kind of learned from this research. First of all, truth is holistic, not compartmentalized. Different fields of learning should influence each other. They shouldn't be kind of off in their hermetically sealed little areas that all the people from a certain major are just studying their thing and not interacting with anyone else. I think that's very applicable at a liberal arts university like Bethel, that what we learn in our different classes and our different fields of study, we should be able to harmonize with what we know to be true from our faith and kind of make it into a coherent worldview. Secondly, even very diverse sources of truth can be harmonized. The church throughout the Middle Ages had kind of tended to downplay and deny the achievements of pagan philosophy because they were very careful to avoid pagan religion. But starting in the Renaissance, they started to affirm that yes, there was some truth in Greek and Roman philosophy, and that that can be compatible with Christianity, and that you can kind of create synthesis between them. And so that's what Pope Julius and Raphael are suggesting visually in these paintings. But finally, all truth ultimately points to and is fulfilled in God's revelation in Christ. That if you don't have that Christian foundation, it doesn't really mean anything because you don't know what the ultimate meaning is, because Christ is the one in whom all things were made, in whom all things hold together, and that he's the way, the truth, and the life. And so that Raphael's still clearly affirming those central Christian doctrines. And I think it's just a testament to the power of art and the power of images that these visual decisions made by Raphael 500 years ago can still, I think, communicate so powerfully to us today in a very different context. And that his library and the way he decorated his library can have implications for what we do in our library and in our lives as truth seekers and as learners at Bethel. So that's what I learned from this project. I had a lot of fun doing it, and I'm very thankful to the Friends of the Library for this award and for the opportunity to present this to you today. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
That was just outstanding. It just opened up things to me I absolutely didn't know before. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I hope you found your research rewarding in lots of ways. And thank you for sharing it with us this morning so vividly. And we'll be watching your career with We're so fortunate to have people of Nathan's caliber working with us here. We're going to ask the department's chairs from history and art to come up and have a presentation to make the ceremonial handoff. The research prize. Our winner last year was from the history department, one of the fine students, and our winner this year is from the art department. So Dr. Chris Rich will present this trophy to.
Nathan should hold it first. Just that it was a good run.
Back next year.
He'll be back. I was telling Wayne before, I got an email from Carol Craig the other day saying the head is in the shop. I can't really elaborate too much, but we're sprucing this up for Nathan. So Nathan, I'll give it to Wayne this recognition. But at least the honor for it. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Now it comes home to the source of complex and holistic truth. I think there's a little competition going on, which is great. So, yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Nathan. Really fun project.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, very fun project.
Excellent.
So
Well,
if
again,
you want to
thank
visit this, it's in my office.
Once again, thank you so much for joining us. We do have some refreshments over here. Hope you help yourself. And we hope the rest of your day goes well.